Thank you for your kind introduction, Professor Donna Lee Bowen and Professor Grant Underwood. Where are you? I can't see you with these glasses. Thank you for your invitation and for all the committee for inviting us here today. I'm so pleased to be on the enchanting campus of BYU again and to share with you some aspects of my research this time. My talk will draw on my work on women's Islamic movements, empowerment, and subjectivity. So as an anthropologist, I will really tell you a story. I will not try to give you a general sense of what gender in Islam is. What I'm going to ask you to do is to listen to the story, to the case study, and you can make your own conclusions. So I take an approach that primarily relies on fieldwork and participant observation to verify my theoretical assumptions and often to debunk normative assumptions concerning Islam in the Middle East. My focus took me to a community of Islamic women activists in Cairo, Egypt. My objective then was to learn how, rather than why, women's Islamic activism develops and how we can understand it better. My interest had been piqued by the unprecedented feminist scholarship that was paid at the time to gender empowerment and women's status in Muslim-majority societies. While many studies rushed to applaud the feminist potential of Islamic activism for improving women's status in Muslim-majority societies, others remained skeptical about the extent of any empowerment that Islam may offer women in Arab and Middle Eastern Muslim societies. Viewed as misogynist and patriarchal to the extreme, Muslim-majority countries are often depicted as hostile to women, which has led some to claim that Islamic women activists buy into the very discourses that subjugate them. Further noting that women who join Islamic movements and organizations parrot their male leaders, and others maintain that Muslim activist women have access to leadership only under male supervision and command. In the midst of all these debates taking place on a transnational level, the Muslim women activists themselves hastened to reject completely the feminist label, insisting that their work was to gain God's favor and not to challenge patriarchal power or to covet it for themselves. This was an interesting moment for me to start my own research to figure out what was really going on. I collected fieldwork data over the course of several years, working with two Islamic women-run private voluntary organizations, or PVOs, in Cairo, Egypt. Egypt is the most populous country in the Arab world. We like to say, us Egyptians, that we are known for our humor and also, of course, our overpopulation. Cairo is where most Egyptians congregate, so it's quite a large country situated in North Africa. Anyway, so the embodied mission and objectives of the women's Islamic movement in Egypt and many other centers elsewhere in the Middle Eastern region is basically to represent, through their behavior, an ideal image of what a Muslim woman should be like. And through perfecting themselves, they also get to reform society. The larger of the two PVOs where I conducted my research was called Al-Hilal. It was run by a core group of women and a larger number of volunteers, about 200, who were not always permanent. Some of them were the core permanent group and others were kind of freelancing. This particular organization belonged to a transnational network of women's Islamic organizations. The women's Islamic movement owes much of its success to this network, which continues to be its driving force. It maintained transnational ties with other organizations that often sent women activists to occasionally visit Al-Hilal. These networks were so far-reaching that when a devastating earthquake hit Pakistan in 2005, Al-Hilal, together with the sister organizations in Egypt, mobilized enough resources to send 6 42-foot containers of relief food and clothing to Pakistan within 2 weeks of the disaster. The Muslim women activists I worked with embodied forms of empowerment that provide an Islamic alternative to general conceptions of empowerment in international development literature informed by universalist modern liberal norms. Women engaged in Islamically reforming their societies operate from within structures of authority which privilege men, paradoxically and often unintentionally finding themselves in positions of power by acting in accordance with prevalent norms of ideal female Muslim behavior. While women's roles shift to reflect their activism, they begin to assume privileges and statuses in society that can be assumed to be empowerment in a liberal modern sense. Yet, I argue, these shifts in roles and statuses are more complex and multi-layered when viewed from the perspective of the women themselves. Their point of departure for this analysis, for a more nuanced reading of the nature of their engagements with Islamic practice and often how they redraw the limits of normative gender roles. More importantly, we can also see how concepts of empowerment predicated upon universalist assumptions do not fully capture the impact of Islamic activism, nor women's engagement with movements recognizing faith as an organizing principle. Islamic activism appeared to redefine not only women's, but also men's physical discursive space. As women became more active religiously and men's monopoly over the public religious domain began to be challenged, this produced conflict and tensions between men's and women's groups. These challenges were not, however, interpreted as gender struggles, and the successes or failures the women experienced were not viewed as power issues, but were viewed as part of the struggle for piety and Islamic social reform leading to God's blessing. In some cases I have observed in my fieldwork, the activist women's high level of religious piety and social respectability compelled even obligated male leaders to publicly endorse women's Islamic activism and to even cede some control over religious spaces and activities. Through the various forms of activism and social work that they do, acquiring a good grasp of Islamic teachings and conducting their Islamic practices and rituals accordingly, these activist women asserted their claims on this newly found space. Those claims intersect with socially acceptable gender norms, social values placed on age, education, and even the endorsement of government institutions, and furthers their sense of self and enabled their pious work. These interventions do not, however, in and of themselves act as indicators or goals of empowerment for the Islamic activist women. In other words, assuming positions of power or acquiring control over space and resources do not appear to be goals pursued by activist women, but were first and foremost means to gaining piety and religious fulfillment. So now I'm going to give you just an overview of what this activist endeavors are, or how these activist endeavors play out, what the women's Islamic movement in Cairo looks like, and so on. So for decades now, Islamic women have led an activist movement for social reform in Egypt, centered in the capital. They preach in mosques to other women. They teach classes in Islamic theology and law. They lead philanthropic activities and often organize large-scale funding events that fund their activism. And educated women also lead the whole congregation in prayer, by the way. They have attracted much media attention, not all positive, and are considered authorities on issues dealing with Islam and gender, the family, and social and Islamic ethics. While many activist women preach informally, most of the well-known preachers are actually certified to teach by the Ministry of Religious Endowments. They attract thousands of city women around to hear their sermons. The majority of these women, da'iyat, which is preachers, do not adopt feminism in their outlook, nor do they have particular interest in addressing issues of gender equality. Their discourse is primarily aimed at perfecting the self through enhancing its relationship to God. Unlike their main counterparts who are employed by the Ministry of Religious Endowments and therefore operate within the confines of the official government agenda, women's sermons focus on the daily needs of the modern Muslim woman. These needs include, but are not restricted to, raising children Islamically, conducting oneself according to Islamic teachings, and the various challenges of being Muslim in a globalizing and westernizing world. Their non-official capacity enables them to somehow freely address the issues that are relevant to them and to their audience, such as extramarital sex, birth control, abortion, and the like. These endeavors have created a momentum in society and has reversed some of the stereotypes about Islamic women being passive and oppressed, representations which often marginalized and denied them a role in the religious, social, and political aspects of government. With the growing trends in Islamism in Egypt before the revolution of 2011, and then again after the Muslim Brotherhood became the ruling party, Islamic women became more publicly engaged than ever before. Although the activist women on whom the study is based is not part of the Muslim Brotherhood whatsoever, the brief period during which the party were in control acted as a catalyst for the activism that was started prior to the revolution. They began conducting forms of dialogue to create awareness of the political situation. They even invited people from community to learn about voting. Women generally don't vote in Egypt, and so they promoted voting, they taught women how to vote, etc. And so they were really involved in the political process. Now I turn to a discussion of empowerment to give you a sense of how empowerment is generally understood in development literature, primarily in United Nations discourse. Empowerment has become a commonly used term to refer to the ability of an individual to be enabled. That is, to be free to exercise their power in decision-making and in making choices which shape their future. Despite the universality of the term, however, few attempts have been made towards developing a definition of empowerment. Often viewed as problematic and ambiguous, the word empowerment is not easily translated because it does not exist in most languages. In the Arabic language, the term temkeen refers to the state of being empowered. Yet it does not fully capture the notion of power and points instead to a state of being enabled. Tamkeen is employed in technical development language and is seldom, if ever, used in Arabic colloquial. Social understanding of tamkeen, or power, as maykana, have some negative associations with tyrannical power. Tamakkun, which is the verb, implies the ability to dominate. One study by Oxel and Baden provides an extensive survey of development organizations and NGOs that aim at understanding one of the term's usages, implications, and indicators. So, according to Oxel and Baden, the notion of empowerment is derived from the birth of the idea of Western individualism. So they list a different, taxonomy of the word empowerment from the word power itself. So power itself is as follows: power over, relations of domination; power to, which is the creative and enabling power; power with, which centers around the organization of people to achieve collective good; and power within, which refers to self-confidence, awareness, and assertiveness. When development projects seek to empower women, they address specific criteria mainly derived from these standards, or a combination of them. Criteria for women's development include participation in decision-making, as well as the creation of an awareness among women that they may be entitled to occupy a decision-making space in the public sphere, to make choices, to be able to shape their environment. Power is generally articulated as a possession and determines whether individuals are dominant or oppressed. Central to this vision of empowerment, which has gained impetus in development discourse, is the notion that power belongs to the individual rather than the collective. Entrepreneurship and individual self-reliance are emphasized over cooperation as means of challenging power structures which are seen as subordinating women. Many of these assumptions regarding empowerment emerge from the modern liberal conception of the individual, which are often inapplicable to community-based societies. In contrast to the liberal modern reading of empowerment prevalent in development discourse, the Islamic women activists that I worked with in Cairo find an empowerment from within such relations of power. They subscribe to Muslim feminine ideals demonstrating that women are not merely subjugated in relations of power, but are indirectly empowered as a result of the dynamics in these relationships. As Islamic women preach modesty and emphasize traditional feminine roles, they exemplify the very qualities that liberal theorists called for replacing with independence, freedom against oppression, sexual liberty, and freedom from gender discrimination. The Muslim women activists I worked with were more concerned with something else. Theirs was the project that began with the self as a site for social development. To these women, activism as a service to others lies at the heart of this process. Most development theories and schools of feminist thought define strategies as resistance, contesting male authority, as paths for women's empowerment. While these are paths that are not entirely absent from the experiences of the women I worked with, resistance, autonomy, and independence in themselves were often necessary means to attaining the larger goal of social change. In fact, the tensions between the pursuit of a religious ideal that women define as being closer to their God often intersected with such liberal feminist ideals. These tensions and negotiations between what are often perceived as conflicting traditions are far more complex and complementary than they are dichotomous. The various forms of empowerment that Islamic activist women experience in their movements are born out of these creative tensions and intersections. While Islamic activism occasionally places women in positions that challenge male authority, such as, for instance, competition over resources or public spaces where they preach, or social reform projects where male religious leaders may have led in the past, the general consensus is that this is acceptable as long as these efforts are for the general good. The gender ideology that informs this general consensus is based on an Islamic model that emphasizes the complementarity of the different roles of women and men rather than their absolute equality. They are, in other words, equal but different. The goal is to effect harmony and balance in society with the belief in the justice of God as the ultimate judge of all things in the world. Yet many of the women I interviewed who worked in Islamic social reform organizations often experienced a kind of empowerment in remaking themselves as ideal Muslim women. For instance, Salma, one of the leaders at an Islamic Center for Women, recounts that empowerment is related to her sense of success, self-enhancement. She spoke about how she undertakes a strict disciplinary attitude towards her sense of religiosity. Islam acts as a constant frame of reference to her in every action of the day. Salma explained how she sets high standards for herself because she is a da'iyah, preacher. She was reluctant to talk about her empowerment as we discussed the various manifestations of the concept in her opinion. After some minutes into our discussion, Salma finally said, "You know, if it weren't for the fact that this concept is so important to you, I would never mention this to anyone. Saying that I am empowered is in direct contradiction to what I represent as a da'iyah. My duty is to be modest and unassuming. It is true that my religious role gives me a sense of power and achievement compared to those who involve themselves in trivialities, but talking about it should just not be done. It's against the spirit of Islam." Others, like Karima, a younger woman in her 30s, described a sense of well-being inspired by her relationship with God. To her, Islam is about how you treat others and about how you translate your faith into action. Though at first she was never really interested in Islamic practice beyond what is daily ritual, she began paying attention to Islamic social work taking place in her neighborhood after her return from a short pilgrimage to Mecca. She started by attending classes in Islamic theology, which introduced her to Islamic social work. Karima echoed the voices of many women at Al Hilal. The knowledge she gained in her Islamic classes enabled her to be a well-learned individual who not only managed her home life but she also began to volunteer at the center by teaching arts and crafts to children. When asked how she found the time to do all this, Karima laughed, saying that Al Hilal's teachings improved her time management skills. As she described how, Karima was emphatic, quote, "When you follow God in your heart and you know what He wants and you aspire to do it, everything falls into place. Your life, including your kids, your husband, and your home, seem to fit together. You are able to perform much better at all these things you are responsible for and more. You also help other women learn about their religion," unquote. Karima teaches others about Muslim ideals of womanhood that focus on closeness to the divine, dedication to Islamic teaching, knowledge and learning. As a teacher, she embodies these values to her fellow activists. I had similar discussions with other activists, such as Maha, a wife and mother in her 40s. Maha was a high achiever. She graduated at the top of her class and worked as an assistant professor for a short time before she moved on to banking. She now dedicates her time to Islamic activist work and is one of the leaders at the center. Maha was the epitome of patience and care, even when faced with the most challenging situations. Attempting to understand what activism meant to her, I asked her how she would feel if she were to stop her activist work. Startled by the question, she stared back as if the thought never crossed her mind till that moment. Then she said, quote, "It will affect my relationship to God. If I do not perform these acts of kindness, it will sever a strong link to God. I cannot see myself without this. This activism is a reward that God has sent me. I would feel deprived from a privilege that I tremendously enjoy to help others and attend to their needs." Maha interprets the satisfaction she gets from Islamic activism as a divinely given privilege. In this, her views seem to parallel many of the Islamic activist women I spoke with. To them, Islamic social work is a gift from God and a way to piety. Activism is not a conscious pursuit for fame or social recognition. Far from it. In fact, this work was about placing their will and agency in the hands of God. Any empowerment, therefore, which emanates from these activities is not understood in this rationale as a direct consequence of the action, but rather as born out of the religious experience. Using the word in English, I asked Maha what it meant to her and how she would define empowerment. Her response deflected from any possible confusion that I might have about conflating empowerment with autonomy or agency. She continued to explain that Islamic activist women enjoy positions of authority, such as the director of the organization, but that these situations develop as these women succeed in achieving high positions or high levels of religious knowledge, and as they themselves become role models for others who respect and admire them. But Maha here is using empowerment to mean power over others in an authority sense. Salma used empowerment to mean a higher level of self-confidence and assurance. However, neither of them sees empowerment as a goal of their Islamic activism. Rather, they see it both as a natural outcome of religious duty as well as of activism. Maha explains, quote, "These women do not covet power. What they seek is a religious perfection which will bring them closer to God," unquote. This image of religious perfection is, however, defined and articulated by discourses which rest on patriarchal sources of Islamism. There are two main theoretical problems that Islamic women activists pose to liberal feminist conceptions of empowerment. First, they belong to a tradition, Islam, which is perceived as being oppressive to women. Generally interpreted as a patriarchal religion which favors males over females, they fit into a generalized feminist stereotype of oppressed women. Secondly, Islamic women activists endorse a gender ideology that is not predicated upon a universal feminist view of gender equality as means for women's empowerment. Instead, they emphasize in their daily activities their religious zeal, virtue, and high levels of moral ideals as prescribed means to self-enhancement. These women had varying viewpoints about gender relations, and many even did not consider the matter of gender difference as an issue in Islam. The majority of them see that God created the female and male to complement one another, to fulfill different roles in society, which are outlined in the Quran. Islamic women do not converge on the issue, but they are clear on the fact that men and women are different. They view the relationship between wife and husband to be based on responsibilities as well as obligations, so that a harmonious and equitable relationship prevails in the family and both partners enjoy the rights which Islam has decreed for them. Many of them maintain that the Quran never restricted roles based on gender and argue that motherhood, though most certainly an honored position in the Quran, was never presented as a sole option for women. The vigorous involvement of Islamic women in the public sphere to Islamically reform society in Muslim-majority countries such as Egypt could not be generalized as an act of feminist empowerment, which would obscure the nuances and the complexities of pious activism undertaken by women. Although women's Islamic activism has shifted their position in society and has redrawn the boundaries for gender roles in ways typically identified with feminist outcomes, this interpretation glosses over the women's desires and aspirations for pious fulfillment and religious service. A sense of empowerment is not altogether absent from these women's lives, nor should we assume that Islamic engagement leads to the polar opposite of empowerment in a liberal modern sense. It's important to consider, though, that liberal modernist criteria for empowerment that advocate for independence and autonomy as markers of the modern individual who is free to choose an identity and lifestyle, regardless of the social fabric in which they live, cannot adequately critically analyze an empowerment for women whose worldview is not consistent with this type of ethos. Theirs is a sort of empowerment contingent upon relinquishing the forms of power that derive from overt resistance, and relies instead on socially cogent notions of perseverance, cooperation, and the attainment of higher levels of religiosity. Working both inwards to hone their pious selves, as well as outwards in their communities to reform them Islamically, activist Muslim women see these efforts as inseparable from their faith and their worship. Despite what these experiences bring to their own lives, neither the sense of pride in what they do, nor the acquired confidence from working on social reform are in themselves their coveted reward. Clearly, a consideration of empowerment which regards this subject as created by social relations, not as autonomous from them, provides a more lucid understanding of the impact of Islamic activism on women's lived experience, and provide a better understanding of empowerment as a unit of analysis for future development projects. Thanks for listening.